In 1982, an underwater archaeologist named George Bass pulled a shipwreck from the floor of the Mediterranean off the coast of Turkey, and what he found inside it changed the way historians think about the ancient world. The ship had sunk around 1300 BC, and on board were copper ingots from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan, glass from Egypt, ebony from sub-Saharan Africa, amber from the Baltic coast, Canaanite wine jars, Mycenaean pottery, and a golden scarab bearing the name of Nefertiti. 11 countries represented on a single vessel. Not a royal gift ship, not a diplomatic mission, just an ordinary merchant voyage, going about its ordinary business, in a world that was, by 1300 BC, more interconnected than most people today realize. The Eastern Mediterranean in 1250 BC was the most sophisticated network of civilizations the world had ever seen, and they were not merely aware of each other from a distance. They were economically dependent on each other, in ways that would feel familiar to anyone who has thought about global supply chains. Egypt under Ramesses II controlled the Nile Valley and Canaan. The Hittite Empire stretched across Anatolia. Mycenaean Greece commanded the Aegean. The city of Ugarit on the Syrian coast was one of the wealthiest trading hubs on earth, a place where merchants from half a dozen cultures lived and worked side by side. Cyprus supplied copper to the entire known world, and Assyria was rising in Mesopotamia. What bound them together was not politics or religion but something far more powerful and far more fragile. They needed each other to function. The copper came from Cyprus and the tin from Afghanistan, and without both of them together you could not make bronze, and without bronze there were no weapons, and without weapons there was no army, and without an army there was no empire. The grain came from Egypt and Anatolia. The purple dye came from Phoenicia. The glass came from specialized workshops that supplied the whole Mediterranean world. We know this because they left a paper trail, or rather, a clay trail. In 1887, archaeologists excavating at Tel El Amarna in Egypt discovered 382 clay tablets that had been sitting in the ground for 3,000 years, and when they were translated, they turned out to be the actual diplomatic correspondence between the great kings of the Bronze Age. Pharaohs writing to Hittite kings writing to the rulers of Babylon. Requests for gold, complaints about delayed shipments, marriage negotiations conducted with the careful formality of men who understood that the stability of the world depended on their relationship. One letter from the Hittite king to Pharaoh reads, with a directness that feels almost modern, "Send me gold, for gold is as plentiful as dust in your land." These were men who knew each other, who traded insults and wedding gifts and military intelligence across thousands of kilometers of sea and desert, who had built over centuries a system of mutual dependence so complete that no single kingdom could function without the others. This was globalization, 3,000 years before we invented the word. The system had been running with periodic disruptions for over 500 years by 1250 BC. It had survived wars, droughts, plagues, and the kind of political upheaval that ends dynasties and reshapes borders. The Egyptians and Hittites had fought one of the largest chariot battles in history at Kadesh in 1274 BC, and then signed a peace treaty and went back to trading with each other. The system was resilient. It had weathered everything. Until it didn't. Between approximately 1200 and 1150 BC, a span of 50 years, roughly 2 human generations, every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean either collapsed entirely or was reduced to a ghost of what it had been. Not one of them, not two of them, but all of them within living memory of each other, in a cascade of failures that still keeps historians awake at night trying to explain. Ugarit fell first or near enough to first that the difference hardly matters. The city of Ugarit on the coast of modern Syria was one of the great cosmopolitan centers of the ancient world, a population of perhaps 8,000. In the city itself, 5 harbors busy with traffic. From across the Mediterranean, merchants who spoke 6 languages as a matter of course. Archives containing tens of thousands of clay tablets, written in 7 different scripts. It was, by any measure, a sophisticated, wealthy, and deeply connected city. We know exactly when Ugarit died. Not approximately, not within a generation. Exactly because of a single object, discovered by archaeologists in 1929. The last letter ever sent from Ugarit was found still inside the kiln, where it was being fired when the city fell. The addressee never received it. Nobody ever came back to retrieve it. For 3,000 years it sat in the ruins of that kiln, unread, waiting. The letter was from the king of Ugarit to the king of Alatia, modern Cyprus, and it reads like a man who is watching the world end and still hoping someone can help. He wrote, "My father, the enemy ships have come. They have been setting fire to my cities and have done terrible things in the countryside. All my troops are in the Hittite land. My country is abandoned." He was asking for help. Help never came. Ugarit was destroyed and never rebuilt, and in the ruins archaeologists found grain, still sitting in the storage jars, valuables still inside the houses, as if the population had fled or been killed. Before anyone had time to take anything with them, the kilns were still warm. The Hittite Empire died differently, and in some ways, more mysteriously because it was not destroyed, so much as it simply stopped. At their height, the Hittites controlled an empire, stretching from the Aegean coast of Turkey to the borders of Mesopotamia, and their capital Hattusa was a city of 40,000 people, which was enormous by the standards of the Bronze Age, with massive stone temples, a royal palace, and defensive walls 6 kilometers in circumference. That would have made any attacker think twice. By 1180 BC, Hattusa was empty. Not destroyed in battle, not burned by an invading army, but emptied, deliberately, systematically, completely. The great grain magazines were found cleared. The temples had been stripped of their cult statues. The royal archives had been removed. Someone had decided to leave, and they had taken everything with them, and they had never come back. The Hittite Empire, 500 years of history, one of the most powerful states the ancient world had produced, simply ceased to exist, and within a generation the Hittite language was dead, the religion was gone, the administrative system had vanished. There are almost no Hittite texts from after 1180 BC, because there were almost no Hittites. In Greece, the collapse left a wound so deep that it took 4 centuries to recover from, and the recovery, when it came, had no memory of what had been lost. The Mycenaeans were the Bronze Age Greeks, the Greeks of Homer, the warriors of the Iliad, the builders of the palace at Mycenae, with its famous lion gate that still stands today. Their civilization centered on palace complexes at Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, and Thebes, and it had sustained itself for centuries through a combination of agriculture, trade, and the kind of administrative sophistication that only a literate palace economy can achieve. The palace at Pylos was destroyed by fire around 1180 BC, and what makes that destruction extraordinary is that the fire preserved the evidence of its own coming. Before the palace burned, the scribes had been frantically recording everything they could on clay tablets, inventories, lists of workers assigned to coastal defense, orders mobilizing rowers to defend against an unspecified threat coming from the sea, and those tablets were baked hard by the very fire that destroyed the palace, so that what the scribes wrote in their final hours survived when everything else was ash. Within a century, all the Mycenaean palace centers had fallen, and the linear B writing system, the only writing the Mycenaeans had, disappeared with them. Greece entered 4 centuries of what historians call the Greek Dark Ages, a period in which the population collapsed dramatically, long-distance trade ceased, monumental architecture stopped, and literacy vanished so completely that when writing reappeared in Greece around 800 BC, it was an entirely new script that the Greeks had borrowed from the Phoenicians because no one remembered Linear B, and no one remembered Mycenae as a real place. It had become myth. Egypt survived, but only barely, and only Ramesses III, who fought 2 great battles against the invaders, he called the Sea Peoples, managed to hold the country together. His inscriptions at Medinet Habu describe a world that has come undone. No land could stand before their arms. Not Hittite, not Canaan, not Alashia. Ramesses defeated them, but he was the last pharaoh who could, and the Egypt that emerged from the Bronze Age collapse was a contracted, impoverished, fractured kingdom that would spend the next 5 centuries slowly losing everything it had built. For civilizations, for different endings, for different immediate causes, and yet every single one of them, Egypt and Ugarit and the Hittites and Mycenaean, mentions in its final records the same thing. Ships coming from the sea, burning cities, destroying everything in their path. Who were they? The Sea Peoples are the most famous explanation for the Bronze Age collapse, and they appear in the Egyptian records as waves of migrants and warriors attacking from the sea, named by Ramesses III in his inscriptions: the Peleset, the Tcheker, the Shikalesh, the Denyen. The Peleset are almost certainly the Philistines of the Bible, but where the others came from is a question that has occupied scholars for over a century and has never been conclusively answered. The dominant current theory, however, is deeply unsettling in its implications because it suggests that the Sea Peoples were not an outside force that caused the collapse, but a product of it, refugees from the civilizations that were already falling, from destroyed Mycenaean cities and failing Aegean islands, who moved east and south looking for somewhere to survive, and who consumed as they moved, so that each wave of displaced people created the conditions for the next wave. The collapse, in other words, generated its own accelerant. In 2013, a team of paleoclimatologists published a landmark study that added another dimension to the picture, using pollen cores extracted from lake sediments. Across the eastern Mediterranean, they reconstructed the climate of the region between 1500 and 900 BC, and what they found was striking. Starting around 1200 BC, exactly coinciding with the beginning of the collapse, the region entered a period of severe and prolonged drought that dramatically reduced crop yields and shrank the agricultural surplus that the palace economies depended on. A 2022 study in the journal PLOS One extended this finding further, analyzing isotopes from cave stalagmites in Cyprus and finding evidence of a 300-year drought, beginning around 1200 BC, the worst dry period in the region's recorded history. But drought alone doesn't explain the collapse, because societies survive droughts, and the Egyptians in particular had been managing the unreliability of the Nile flood for millennia, developing sophisticated systems of grain storage and redistribution that were specifically designed to carry the population through lean years. What the drought did was stress the system at exactly the same moment as other stresses were accumulating elsewhere, and the cumulative weight of all of them together was more than the system could bear. It was not the cause. It was one blade of a pair of scissors. Some scholars have pointed to a third factor. Evidence at several destroyed Bronze Age sites suggests not outside attack but internal collapse, with destruction patterns consistent with uprisings of the laboring population against the palace administrators, who extracted their grain, their labor, and their sons. in exchange for a protection and a prosperity that, by 1200 BC, they could no longer deliver. The Bronze Age palatial economy was extractive, in the most literal sense, and when the system could no longer provide what it had always promised, when the grain stores ran low, and the trade goods stopped arriving, and the military failed to protect, the question that every population eventually asks became unavoidable: why follow a king who cannot feed you? In 2022, the archaeologist Eric Klein, who has written more influentially about the Bronze Age collapse than almost anyone else alive, published an updated analysis, and his conclusion was both satisfying and humbling. There was no single cause. The Bronze Age collapse was what systems theorists call cascading failure, a perfect storm of simultaneous, interacting stresses that broke a system which had become too interconnected and too specialized and too rigid to adapt when multiple things went wrong at once. The drought reduced agricultural output, which stressed the palace economies, which disrupted the trade networks, which cut off the supply of tin and copper, which degraded military capacity, which invited raiding, which generated refugees, who became the sea peoples, who attacked the already weakened cities. Each failure caused the next failure, and the system that had been its own greatest strength, its extraordinary interconnection, its deep specialization, its centuries of mutual dependence, became, in the end, its greatest vulnerability. When one part broke, everything broke. The most extraordinary thing about the Bronze Age collapse is that we have voices from inside it. The clay tablets of Ugarit, Hattusa, and Pylos were baked hard by the fires that destroyed them, and they survived precisely because of the catastrophe, so that what was preserved is not the record of a civilization at its height, but the record of a civilization in its final hours, the thoughts of administrators, merchants, scribes, and kings, who were living through the end of their world, without knowing that it was the end, who were doing their jobs and managing their affairs, and writing their letters, with no idea that what they were writing would be the last thing their civilization ever produced. The archives of Ugarit contain thousands of tablets from the final decades of the city's existence, and reading through them chronologically is to watch a civilization gradually realize that something has gone very wrong. The early tablets are routine. A merchant complains that a customer in the city of Emar has not paid for a shipment of purple dye. A scribe records the inventory of the palace wine cellar. A judge rules on a land dispute between two farmers. Ordinary commercial life, conducted with the confidence of people who expect that tomorrow will resemble today. The later tablets begin to show the strain. Grain has not arrived from Egypt. The harvest was poor. Could Cyprus send emergency supplies? There are requests for military support, directed at allies who reply with sympathy, and nothing else because they are dealing with their own shortages. And then the final tablets, watchmen being posted on the coast, troops being mobilized, and the letter that was still being fired in the kiln. When the city fell, the king of Ugarit writing to the king of Cyprus that the enemy ships have come, that his countryside is burning, that all his forces are away, that his country is abandoned, and then silence, 3,000 years of it, broken only by the archaeologist's trowel in 1929. From Hattusa, the last surviving letter is addressed to the Pharaoh of Egypt, the old rival, the old ally, the partner of 5 centuries of shared history. And the Hittite king is asking for grain, which is perhaps the most devastating sentence in all of Bronze Age literature, because what it tells us is that the king of what had been the most powerful empire in the Near East was, in his final years, reduced to begging his neighbor for food. He writes, with a plainness that needs no elaboration, It is a matter of life and death. We do not know whether the pharaoh replied. We know that within a decade, Hattusa was empty. The Pylos tablets tell a slightly different story because what they preserve is not correspondence, but emergency administration, the records of a palace bureaucracy, working at maximum speed. In the days or weeks before the end, rowers being conscripted, watchers being stationed on the coast, quantities of bronze being collected from the temples, sacred objects melted down for weapons, because the emergency had grown beyond the capacity of ordinary means to meet it. The scribes were recording everything with the obsessive thoroughness of people who believed that the record still mattered, that the system was still worth documenting, that tomorrow someone would need to know how many rowers had been sent to which coast, and how much bronze had come from which temple. The records survived. The palace did not. What makes these tablets so affecting is not the historical information they contain, but the human detail that runs through all of it, the merchant who never got paid, the scribe who recorded the wine inventory, on a day when the end was already visible on the horizon, the king who wrote that it was a matter of life and death, in a letter that arrived too late or not at all. These were not legendary figures, not heroes of myth. They were administrators doing their jobs. In an empire that was dying under them, people with families and debts and routines who had no idea that the civilization they were part of was about to disappear so completely that within 3 generations, their descendants would not be able to write. 400 years after the collapse, a Greek poet named Homer was composing what would become the foundational texts of Western literature, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and the world he was describing, the world of Achilles and Agamemnon and the great ships that sailed to Troy, was the Bronze Age world that had been dead for those 400 years. Homer was singing about a civilization that his own ancestors had been part of, that their descendants had forgotten so thoroughly, that by Homer's time it had passed entirely from history into myth, and the tragedy of it is that neither Homer nor his audience knew that the heroes of the Iliad were real people from a real civilization that had actually existed and actually fallen. They thought they were listening to legend. They were listening to history that had forgotten it was history. That is how completely the Bronze Age collapse erased what came before. The 4 centuries that followed the collapse are called the Greek Dark Ages, and the name is slightly misleading because it implies violence and chaos, when what actually characterized them was something quieter and in some ways more devastating. Silence. No writing, no monumental architecture, no long-distance trade, dramatically reduced population, and a contraction of human ambition that must have felt, to the people living through it, not like the aftermath of a catastrophe, but simply like the way things were. The communities that made it through were the ones that could feed themselves from their own land, the ones that didn't need tin from Afghanistan to make their tools, the ones whose economies were local enough that when the global system failed, they still had something to fall back on. Complexity had been the Bronze Age's greatest achievement, and in the end, its fatal weakness. One detail from the collapse is particularly worth holding on to. Of all the Bronze Age civilizations, Cyprus recovered most quickly. Within a generation or 2 of the worst years, Cypriot cities were being rebuilt, and trade was resuming, on a smaller scale than before, but functioning, viable, alive. The reason was simple. Cyprus had copper, local copper, in its own hills, that it could mine and smelt, without needing to import anything from anyone. When the long-distance supply chains failed, Cyprus didn't need them, because the one thing that made Cyprus valuable was the one thing that couldn't be disrupted by the failure of a trading network. The civilizations that survived were the ones with something irreplaceable and local, the ones that depended entirely on the system, had nothing when the system failed. In March 2021, a container ship called the Ever Given ran aground in the Suez Canal and blocked it for 6 days. Just one ship, just 6 days, and the disruption cost an estimated $9.6 billion and affected supply chains across Europe, Asia, and the Americas. The Bronze Age trading network moved through a small number of critical choke points: the Straits of the Aegean, the ports of Cyprus, the land routes through Canaan, and when those choke points failed simultaneously, the entire system seized, and there was no backup, no alternative route, no reserve capacity that could absorb the shock. We have rebuilt a version of the same system, more efficient than anything the Bronze Age produced, more productive, more interconnected, more specialized, and sustained by supply chains of a complexity and global reach that would have been incomprehensible to any Bronze Age king, and with, as the Ever Given reminded us, the same fundamental vulnerability. When the system is the economy, what happens when the system fails? The Bronze Age kings did not know. Their world was about to end. They were doing what you do when you live inside a civilization, managing their empires, writing their letters, recording their grain inventories, trusting that tomorrow would resemble today, the way tomorrow always had. Most civilizations do continue. Most disruptions are recovered from. The Bronze Age system had survived 500 years of stress before it finally broke. But it did break. And when it broke completely and quickly, and the people inside it had almost no warning. The kilns at Ugarit were still warm. The scribes at Pylos were still recording. The Hittite king's letter asking for grain was still in transit when his empire ceased to exist. They were not ignorant, and they were not passive, and they were not doing anything wrong. They were doing everything right. Within the system they had, the same system that had sustained their civilizations for 500 years, and the system itself had passed beyond the point where doing everything right was enough. We look at them across 3,000 years and see the tragedy with perfect clarity, because we can trace the drought in the pollen cores, read the final letters, map the cascade of failures across the entire Mediterranean, and watch each one feed the next with the cold precision of hindsight. They could not see any of this. They were inside it. The question the Bronze Age collapse actually asks is not what happened to them. It is how clearly we can see our own system from inside it. This has been the Hidden History Vault. The vault is never truly empty.